Groß, willkommen in einen aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting videos case, part 29 of my organisational series. In this video, I'll be looking at the estimated combat strengths of the armies which fought in 1806, 1807 and 1809. This video is an attempt to understand the impact of leadership and command in battles. However, in order to do that, I need to have a more accurate view of the actual raw combat strengths of the actual forces on either side. The combat strengths I am using are based on a point system from a set of Napoleonic figure gaming rules, which are very simple but more accurate than simply comparing the number of men, cavalry and artillery with each other. I have previously done the same thing with World War II and Cold War formations, using, once again, a point system from a figure gaming set of rules. While this system is almost certainly not empirically foolproof, it does give us an idea of the difference in strength of opposing formations based on the raw troop type. That will allow us to identify what component of a victory is due to command, doctrine and leadership as distinct from actual raw combat power. I am actually using a rather simple point system, and it would certainly be possible to use a more complex point system from a more complex set of rules if you so desire. I went for the very simple system as it averages out a lot of detail which I simply do not possess. While we have data on various orders of battle during the Napoleonic period, certainly not as accurate as World War II or the Cold War period, which I have to admit is in itself subject to significant margins of error. And so let's now drill down into the battles. I'll be starting with the Battle of Jena Austerlitz, which occurred on the 14th of October in 1806 between the French and the poor hapless Prussians. This shows the French army, and the French army is rather large, although similar in size to 1805, so I don't see any major difference between 1805 and 1806. We do see that the army is organised into larger corps as distinct from what occurred or the structure in 1806. This shows the Prussian army, which on paper was impressive even if outnumbered by the French. The Prussians did not use a corps system, they used a divisional system. However, they did break up their army under commanders into, I suppose, ad hoc columns, basically ad hoc corps of some description, which is what you see here. A significant clue to why the Prussians were so easily defeated and so decisively defeated can be found here, the force mix. One of the Prussian formations was not involved in the battle, so the true strength on the Prussians on the day, or the 2 days, was 180 points against the French 258 points. It's true one of the French corps did not get involved until the battle was won as well, but even so the Prussians were significantly outnumbered. Another interesting point about the battle was its fluidity. This was not a traditional line it up on both sides and then advance type of battle. This was a very dynamic battle with forces arriving at all sorts of different times. At the start of the battle, the French were outnumbered at Jena, which was the situation on the 13th. By the morning of the 14th, this was the force mix balance. At Jena, the French had quickly achieved parity and were attacking. At Austerlitz, the French were heavily outnumbered. By 1000 hours, the situation at Jena had become desperate for the Prussians, but the Prussians were holding and even successfully launched a counterattack, specifically the Saxons. At Austerlitz, even though they heavily outnumbered the French army, the Prussians were not getting anywhere and even broke in front of the French forces. This was a truly amazing event in the battle and did seal the Prussian fate. By 1200 hours, the Prussians were receiving some reinforcements at Jena, but then so were the French. The Prussians had stabilised their position at Austerlitz, but at Jena they were finally breaking. My quick observation of the battle was in defence the Prussians proved highly effective. On the other hand, when they attempted to attack, particularly on the run, they seemed to fall to pieces. This now makes me think one of the advantages the French had was their ability to form up for an attack quickly. While it's true at Wagram, the French spent 2 hours preparing for an attack on their right flank, this was due to being surprised by the Austrians. The Prussians seemed to need this type of time frame at a minimum in all cases. On the other hand, when forced on the defensive, the Prussians could give a good account of themselves. The ability to respond rapidly, especially in forming up to attack, is more influenced by doctrine and command control than anything else. The Prussian doctrine did not emphasise this type of flexibility. It was all about carefully forming up for the attack and then going forward and attacking. Command control was also an issue. An effective leader could have got the Prussians to move, irrespective of doctrine, and that's one thing that they certainly lacked on the day. The next battle within the same campaign is Eylau, which occurred on the 7th and 8th of February 1807 in rather freezing conditions. This shows the 1st to 6th French Corps as well as the Guard. Not all these corps fought at Eylau. The corps which did fight at Eylau are indicated accordingly. I decided to provide the entire order battle of the French and Russian armies for this campaign. This shows the 7th to 8th Corps, the Grenadier Division and the Cavalry. This was a large army, although the army which fought at Eylau was certainly smaller. When we move over to the Russian army, it was not really much smaller. This shows the 1st Army. Divisions which fought at Eylau are marked accordingly. The Russians organised their forces into two armies. This shows the 2nd Army as well as the Prussian contingent. This shows the formations which actually fought at the battle. Now, one interesting point to note about this battle is that by looking at raw combat powers, the Russian army was superior. It's true the Prussians arrived later in the battle, so the armies which faced each other initially were reasonably equal in strength. But once the Prussians were there, the Russians did technically out-combat or outnumber the French, at least in terms of combat capacity, based on this point system. The strength advantage the Russians possessed may explain why Napoleon failed to win this battle. He lacked the normal superiority that he would normally expect whenever he won significant battles or victories. However, if we compare this with Austerlitz, something had changed. The Russians possessed a new divisional structure, which may not have been as effective as the French corps structure, but gave the Russians many of the same advantages. Other factors are weather, which may have suited the Russians, although I'm not too certain this was a major advantage on the Russian side. I think basically something had changed. The Allies had begun to take on some of the ideas of Napoleon and were beginning to match him. The last battle during this campaign was Friedland, which occurred on the 14th of June 1807. This shows the French forces which were involved in the Battle of Friedland. As for the Russian army, this shows the Russian army which was involved in the battle. Both forces did have additional units outside of range of the battle, so I'm only really covering the formations which were involved in this particular battle. The interesting thing to note in this comparison is the Russians did have a slight superiority. During the battle, the Russians started with a much larger superiority, but French reinforcements quickly evened up both sides. One point is some of the formations in the Russian 1st Division did not become involved in the battle. So both forces were actually almost equal if this was taken into account. Napoleon did win this battle, and a key factor in his victory was his ability to get as much forces to the battle as he could. His superior strategic manoeuvrability made this possible, as well as his decisive command of the situation. On the other hand, the Russians were at a severe disadvantage once these new French forces arrived and quickly found themselves in serious trouble. This was mainly due to the terrain. The Russians had attacked across a major river, with both flanks being unable to support each other. If Napoleon had not managed to act as quickly as he did, the Russians would have almost certainly won a significant victory, although not decisive. I have to chalk this French victory up to the ability of Napoleon to basically strategically respond so rapidly. On the actual battlefield, the Russians performed rather well, even when attacking, so there was no real difference on both sides. Now we move on to 1809, which was the next campaign. In 1809, the Russians, or the Austrians, decided to attack the French, which resulted in two major battles. The battle we will look at in this video is Wagram, which occurred on the 5th and 6th of July 1809. This shows the French forces which were involved in this battle, although some of the weaker corps did not arrive until the end of the battle, but were nonetheless involved in the pursuit and would have been involved in the battle if it had lasted into a second day. Probably one reason why Charles decided to retreat as he did. This shows the Austrian Army which was involved in the battle, which by 1809 had fully adopted the corps system, as you can see here. Looking at this comparison, it's clearly obvious the Austrians were heavily outnumbered in this battle. The French army of Italy had joined Napoleon, and the Austrians failed to get their army from Italy involved in this battle. Nonetheless, they did put up a good showing, considering how badly that they were outnumbered. During the battle, the Austrians were still having issues with forming up an effective coordinated attack. However, considering how badly they were outnumbered, this was probably due to the fact that they were outnumbered rather than any other issue. Although I must admit, the attack they launched in the morning was incredibly uncoordinated. While the Austrians had been defeated in this battle, I can't help but feel the Austrians had finally mastered the art of war which Napoleon had introduced. Napoleon had failed in getting the decisive victory he was so used to, and in the previous battle to Wagram, he actually lost the battle. While it's true 1812 is generally considered the true turning point of the war, you can really see the situation changing between 1807 and 1809. While in 1806, Napoleon did his normal decisive victory, which even exceeded Austerlitz, this was in part due to the numeric superiority of his armies. By Eylau and Friedland and Wagram, a lot of the ability of the French army to outmatch the Allies in attack was fading. However, it had certainly not fully gone. And so we come an end to this video. This concludes my part 29 of my organisational video series, in this case looking at the strengths of the armies which fought in 1806, 1807 and 1809 in an attempt to understand just how much of an influence command and doctrine had in the victories or losses in this battle. While there's no doubt the French still had superiority, particularly in strategic advance, and even at an operational level in doctrine to an extent, most of the differences that we saw in, let's say, 1800 to 1805 had faded, and Napoleon was beginning to find that his opponents were as clever in some ways as he was. But he still had an edge, there's no doubt about that.